What's happening? What's happening? And again, what's happening? How we doing, great folks? Welcome to another episode of the African American Folklorist of the Month. And today we are talking with the African American Folklorist of the month of November. And my guest is a great scholar, someone who I look to and honor, and can't wait to jump into this conversation. Dr. Patricia A. Turner is one of the most influential folklorists of our time. She is a scholar whose work illuminates how African Americans uses our stories, rumors, legends, and material culture to navigate power, preserve memory, and confront racial realities. Across her groundbreaking books, and I'll throw out a couple of titles, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Whispers on the Color Line, Cinematic Uncles, and Celluloid Mammies. I love that title. Crafted Lives, and Trash Talk, which we're going to talk about. Dr. Turner reveals how everyday narratives and objects carry the weight of history and the wisdom of community experience. You know, that's what the African American folklorist is all about, right? Her research shows that folklore is not merely entertainment, it is a survival system, a warning infrastructure, and a powerful archive of Black life. Whether she is analyzing a rumor that spreads through a neighborhood, a quilt stitched across generations, or a stereotype recycled in media, Dr. Turner brings clarity, rigor, and deep cultural insight to the stories African Americans create and circulate. As a respected academic, oh, yes, there's more. As a respected academic leader and a celebrated legend scholar who we ought to give her flowers as often as possible, she has shaped the field of folklore for decades, modeling how scholarship can speak to community truth while challenging the structures that distort it. And that's something I really want to speak about. Um, the intersection of the academy and the community and public facing things, right? In honoring Dr. Turner, we honor her long tradition of Black storytelling, the creativity of Black makers, and the cultural intelligence embedded in the narratives that sustain us. Please, y'all, I got to get me a round of applause button. Let's welcome Dr. Patricia Turner. How are you?
I am fine. I'm humbled by that introduction. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You've done so much for us all. I mean, on all sides of the fence in this field. But as a Black folklorist, Black American folklorist, you've truly done a tremendous job opening the doors for us in multiple spaces.
Well, I had some doors opened for me, and you will open doors for those who come after you, Lamont, and that's what keeps us moving.
So why don't we start there then? Let's start with the doors that were open, and in that, when those doors were being opened, were you being told, "Hey, you're a folklorist," or did you knew you were a folklorist, so you knew where to go to get the doors open?
I did not know I was a folklorist. I went to graduate school thinking that I wanted my research and teaching to be about the African American experience. I was there in the late 70s, early 1980s when this was a relatively new thing for cohorts of graduate students to come to the academy wanting to do. It was a great time. It was, in those days after the civil rights movement, and there'd been some stamps of approval on things. So it was a really heady time to be a student. And all I knew was that I wanted to do things that celebrated, documented, incorporated the perspective of people like my parents and my neighbors and where I came from. But I didn't know there was a thing called folklore where you did that. And I was explaining this to a professor who was of all things a medievalist. Um, medievalists medievalists are very sensitive to oral tradition. So he had a lot of folklore training. And he said to me, I think you're a folklorist. And he said, I think you should go talk to Alan Dundes, who was the premier folklorist at Berkeley at the time. See if you can get into his courses, read his stuff. But he said, I think that's where you ought to spend some time. So I did go and met Professor Dundes. Now, this is a really embarrassing confession for me to make on this program. So you have to say this is a safe space, Lamont, for me to own
This
up.
is a very safe space for you.
Okay. So I went in to see Professor Dundes, and he started rattling off the names of earlier Black folklorists and asking me my familiarity with them. Included in that list was Zora Neale Hurston. And
Hmm.
in 1970, this would have been about 1978, I had never heard of Zora Neale Hurston. A white
Hmm.
Jewish folklore professor sat to me and he said, "Of course you've read Zora Neale Hurston." And I said, "Well, no." And I'm writing down all of these names that he was giving me: Newbell, Niles Puckett, Sterling Brown, other people that I knew Langston Hughes, but I didn't know Langston Hughes as a folklorist. I knew him from other traditions. And he said, "Boy, you've got a lot of reading to do, young lady, to catch up." And he gave me this whole list of books, and he said, "But he said, I guess you can take my graduate course if you also take the undergraduate course at the same time, because you need a foundation in folklore." So we agreed that I would do that. And I took the list, and I'm a real morning person.
Hmm.
So the next morning, I was in the graduate library in the stacks at 8:15 in the GR section with the list of the authors that he had given me the afternoon before. And I was pulling the books off the shelf and had a little pile. And I turned around the corner in the stacks of the library, and he was there getting books.
Wow.
And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you're gonna be fine." And he just I had a mentor for life. I could use the whole program to talk about how many times in my career he was incredibly important to the next stage of it. But no, it took him and the books, and so I had a mentor who told me where to go, and who, you know, having a white mentor who gave me a list of a dozen or so Black scholars to read. He didn't send me he didn't send me to white scholars who'd written about the Black experience, although there were certainly some in the list, very good ones, Larry Levine and so forth. But that was a really key moment for me.
I would like to stay there for a second. And one, thank you for sharing that. This is a safe space, but that's not even, you know, I, because you're possibly one of the first few people, or one of the only few people that share the story of being told that these Black uh, literary legends were folklorists. Like, because a
Yeah,
lot of times we're not told, or
yeah,
it's not mentioned, right?
yes, yeah,
So this guy was, he was on point. What I have to ask you, even though you did share it, but I would like you to go a little more in detail. How did that assert you, give you a straighter back, if you will, coming into this? Because I, I've experienced it, and I know there's younger folklorists that shared with me the challenge
yeah.
of having to or not being able to read or hear about these folk like Sterling Brown, right?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
how did that help straighten your back in this space?
Um, I think that there's a credibility that comes from having the material and having read the material. It would have been a different situation had I, and God knows I can procrastinate as good as anyone else, but had I procrastinated and not, you know, sort of jumped on the opportunity, jumped on it. Because for me, the curiosity is authentic and genuine. So there
Hmm.
was nothing I wanted to do the day after he told me these people existed and that there were books by them that I should read. There was nothing I wanted to do more than read these books. There was no there was no distraction. It was the beginning of a semester. I didn't have competing assignments or anything like that. So um it was my priority. And I can remember it's almost physical when you are reading things that you maybe knew were out there or hoped were out there, and you're just finding it, and you just go, "Oh," and I can sort of remember those moments.
So now, with that being said, um, going through the well, first off, was there a time that you knew or said, "I want to teach," or was there a time that you was like, "I want to go out," and I don't know if that's what the term was at that
Yeah.
time, but do public facing work.
Yeah. Um I well, there's never been a time I didn't want to teach. It was just
Okay.
a matter of what I was gonna teach and at what level. I was one of those little kids that played school, I mean, I always wanted to teach. So that was not a question. In the undergraduate class that Professor Dundies taught, and he was a very charismatic lecturer, big lecture hall, 350 students, foundations of folklore. And we were doing the unit on proverbs. And I remember just sort of kicking back in the seat a little bit because um, proverbs were the literature of my household. Proverbs were how my parents spoke to each other and other people, and to me, they didn't quote, Booker T. Washington or Langston Hughes or anyone. They quoted the Bible. Their wisdom came through proverbs. And suddenly I had been given academic articles that took that seriously, that gave that importance, and gave me a framework for understanding the use of the proverbs that they had. And I said, "Oh yeah, yeah, this is it. This is what, yeah." And I knew that there were always going to be others, young people like myself, or maybe I should just say people like myself, whose education had not shown them anything that was that familiar and that was taken that seriously, and that people developed academic theories about proverbs, and people they took this as seriously as the census date and all the stuff of other courses, the lives of presidents and all the other kind of stuff we got. So I knew that I wanted to be a part of that from the proverb lecture in Anthro 159.
Mm.
Alan Dundee's. I can trace it to if I had the syllabus, I can say that was the day.
Well, so you brought something up. You bring something up that is quite telling for me, right? The fact that there were proverbs in your home and you identify this. So is that the beginning thread to your scholarship through your career as it goes to Black narratives?
To a certain extent, interestingly, in terms of I mean, you can't. I've never taught a course on African American folklore without teaching proverbs. I've only ever done one article on proverbs, but I think that, and when you look at what I have done, I didn't grow up in a household that shared lots and lots of the kinds of conspiracy theories and rumors and legends that I've written about several times. My mother was I wrote a book on quilters. My mother wasn't a quilter, nor my grandmother, as far as I know. But in terms of, you asked about public facing folklore, I had the opportunity in one summer with the Smithsonian Festival of American Folklife to be an intern with Gladys Marie Fry,
Mhm.
who was eminent folklorist and wrote both about legends and about African American quilts. And we worked with Roland Freeman and Worth Long, who had
Wow.
done field work with a group of Alabama quilters. And across the 2 weeks of the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, we had the women there, and they made a quilt on the mall in Washington. And we did sessions a couple of times a day with the public where they talked about their traditions and so forth. And Gladys and I would switch off on moderating those sessions. And that introduced me to quilts, and filed away at, like, I want to do I want to pick up on this someday. So it wasn't from my family per se, but it was from my tradition, and it was from my education. That was part of an educational experience that I went, oh yeah, I want to do I've always been interested in material culture, and these things are strikingly beautiful. And I noticed that when when I would try to interview women, mostly women, but sometimes men too, of that generation, they would be very sparse in their comments about their childhoods, about
Mm.
their parents and growing up. And even my own father, when I tried to interview him about his childhood, he was like, "That's in the past. Why do you care about that? And you should be thinking about the future." And there was a real reluctance to share the meaty stuff that folklorists embrace. But if you had an object, when I asked the women about quilts, if I asked them about the childhoods, I'd get vague answers. If I said, "So how old were you the first time you learned how to quilt, and what was the room like?" They could go into incredible detail then. You gave them something solid to hang on to and go, "Oh, we had a quilt frame," some of them would say, or "We had a dining room table, or we did it outside." So I'd
Mhm.
given them something really specific to hone in on. And here's how, where did you get the material? Well, it was always leftover clothes, or sometimes we would buy special material. And through having something really specific to generate the questions, the rest of the information, okay, you were 7 years old, were you going to school then? Well, we would go a few weeks of the year, but we were sharecroppers, and they'd pull me out of school so that I would work the field. So I'd get the whole story through just asking them about the quilts.
Are y'all paying attention? You're getting methodology right now. um, let me ask you this though, and that's something that we talk about often in my household. And I'm wondering, have you found that to be the same in the multiple groups of folk that you worked with, or is it specific to Black or folk of color or marginalized people that they really don't want to talk about the past too much unless something is central? And do you find that non-folk of color are easier to have that conversation?
I think there are a lot of cultures around this, so it's hard to make a sort of sweeping
Right.
generalization. I think that within the African American community, I mean, I've talked to other folklorists about this, and it's one of the reasons other people, Gladys and other people, got involved with material culture because of the phenomenon as I described it. I think it's probably a little bit more likely marginalized communities do this, but some people come from particular religious traditions that aren't marginalized, but that don't put value on, a lot. Sometimes just there's a misapprehension that if you're talking about the past and something perhaps that your parents or grandparents did that you're proud of, that you're boasting and you come from a tradition that wants you to be reticent about such things and you don't want to be accused of boasting. Other times within the tradition, boasting is valued and celebrated and so forth. So, there's a lot of variety, I think, around that point.
I think you're right, and that reminds me of, I believe it's Lawless. I hope I'm not misquoting. I didn't say that. The piece I didn't say that, right?
Uh-huh.
That's what that reminded me of. Um, so let's kind of talk about conspiracies because even though I wasn't going there next, you kind of invoked my interest when you said, "Well, we didn't talk about conspiracies in my house." So, where did you? What attracted you to those stories?
Okay, yeah, we didn't talk about them a lot. There are certain households where everything that the people in power do is ascribed to a conspiracy. There are certain households that are really dense with conspiracy theorizing around everything, and we weren't one of those.
Okay.
But but certainly, um, I can remember when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and the notion that the official explanation of that, all of the assassinations, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, all of those assassinations generated conspiracy theories, and my household trafficked in them as much as many others did. So I don't want to say we were not without. Um, when I was, again, I keep going back to when I was a student. When I was a student, I took a course, a graduate seminar from uh, a scholar named Bengt Klintberg, um, and Swedish scholar, and it was on rumors and legends, and all of the material all of the material in the course, and particularly the things that we did that were about uh, a reflection of sort of contemporary American life, really focused on the white community. And in fact, one of the probably the premier scholar around what were called urban legends then was Jan Harold Brunvand from Utah, and he had a wildly popular books that sold really well outside of the field of folklore. The most prominent one we read in the course was The Vanishing Hitchhiker, and he has a sentence in there and says that these things enjoy popularity amongst white middle class. He defined a very specific audience, and and I think in an offhand way said, they don't really, exist outside of that or something. And I'm like, no, you're wrong. um, um, because even though, as I say, I didn't come from a particularly conspiracy fearing household. I was in the world. I was going to beauty shops. I was going to parties. I had friends, and I certainly knew what the discourse was in the community. I just realized there weren't a lot of African American folklorists. Jan Brunvand, who became a great friend. And in fact, as soon as I told him I was doing this work, he sent me a whole bunch of files, and it's never been anything but but terrific. And I have to remind your viewers that when people sent you files in the 1970s and 80s, they went to a photocopy machine. They copied things. They put them in an envelope, put a stamp on
Wow.
them with your address. When they sent you stuff, it was a physical, it took their time. It wasn't going through their old emails or taking a file
Right.
from their computer. When somebody said, "Oh, I'll send you some relevant stuff," they were investing some time in you. Um,
Wow.
and anyway, I um, knew from that seminar that the rumor and legend scholarship was off on that point. And when I took my first faculty job in Boston in a department of Black Studies, my students were very familiar with lots of things that I wasn't even familiar with initially. And I realized, what you did in those days was, if you wanted to give an original paper at AFS or at a professional society meeting and make sure you weren't doing something somebody else had done, you would do what I did, which was, again, you reached out by writing an old fashioned letter, putting a stamp on it. And I wrote to Brunband and I wrote to Gary Allen Fine, who worked in the field. And I said, I'm thinking of doing some work on contemporary legend about Church's Fried Chicken. Do you know anything about what I'm sharing? Do you have have you done something on it that I've missed somehow or another? And they all responded, "Oh, I didn't know anything about this. I want to know more about it. You go, girl. And here's what might be helpful, and I'll ask my students and that kind of thing." So I got a lot of affirmation for my first presentations on rumors and legends and conspiracy theories. And you just spent some time in Atlanta in the book room at the American Folklore Society meetings.
Yes,
Uh,
ma'am.
the editors at the university presses would look through the programs and see what you were giving a paper on, and they'd come after you and say, "Are you, this thing that you're doing a paper on?" One of the early ones I did was on the Atlanta child killer. Are you doing a book on that? If you do, I'd really be interested in your sending me a prospectus. So I got a lot of affirmation on the rumor and legend work, and so that was how I ended up there.
I dig it. I have to talk to you about the church chicken piece
Mhm.
that you wrote that I've read more than once, and I've even went back to some of my friends that I grew up with in Brooklyn, and
Uh-huh.
it had some discussions with them about um, do they remember what was being said back then? Because there were so many things going around.
Yeah.
What the first thing I want to ask you is, how did was it the students? How did what brought that to your attention? Because that's very specific, and that's a very, well, let me rephrase this. What I thought at the time of my youth
Uh-huh.
was a very neighborhood thing.
Uh-huh. Yeah, the example of, I was teaching, again, from Jan Harold Brunvan's book, The Legend of the Kentucky Fried Rat, which
Right.
was in circulation earlier than the Church's Fried Chicken one. And I went through with the students and explained what we knew then about its origins, and about the fact that it existed in multiple variations in different parts of the country, that no one had ever been able to actually find an emergency room that anyone was taken to, no lawsuits had ever actually been filed on this, no complaints, that all of the markers that it didn't really happen. And it was a very ethnically mixed class that I was teaching it to. So I don't know if it was exactly 50-50, but it was probably, close to 50% Black and 50% white, Asian, other groups. So we went through the Kentucky Fried Rat, and um, one of the Black students raised his hand and he said, that's like what they say about Church's Fried Chicken. So this is in Boston. He said, that's what they say. And I see some of the other students, some of the other Black students are nodding their head. And he said, yeah, that's like what they say about Church, except you're saying that this thing about Kentucky Fried Chicken isn't true. So it's not exactly like what they say about Church's Fried Chicken, because what they say about Church's Fried Chicken is true. And I said, and the other students, the other Black students are nodding their head. Yeah, what they say about Church's Fried Chicken is true. And the white students are going, what do they say about Church's Fried Chicken? They're like, what's going on here? So I said, well, help me out. So, all of you tell me what you've heard about Church's Fried Chicken. And they told the core story as it existed then, that the Ku Klux Klan owned it, and that there was something in the mixture that sterilized Black male eaters. And they said, and that's true. And I said, how do you don't, in a faculty position like that, I don't um, um, do anything to make students feel as though they need to be defensive
Right.
about anything. And at that point, I didn't know. But where my brain was going was, if there was a substance that could successfully prevent people from having babies, that was tasteless, colorlessness, and cheap enough to put on a fried chicken recipe, wouldn't we be using it for other things? like, is there some magic thing out there that has all of these attributes that the scientific community would hold just for this purpose? So all of the things, and this is what always happens with, or almost always happens with, the rumors and legends. If you're in the intended target group, you hear the things that reinforce what you already believe. If
Absolutely.
you're an academic or not in the intended target group, all of the things that are implausible occur to you right away. What
Right.
happens to women when they eat it? What if a white man eats Church's Fried Chicken? He's not sterilized. Like, how does the chicken know? Like, what is the how,
It's only for Black DNA.
all of the things that make it implausible. So I had a good rapport with my students and with that class. They had folklore projects, so we turned it into a project. They collected. They realized that they disagreed. I think they thought, like you did, that this was something that was sort of only known to them in Boston. But there was part of the rationale then was, and I'd be interested to hear what you heard as well. They said, this is why you don't see the franchise in white neighborhoods, that Church's franchise tends to be in Black neighborhoods.
Only.
Well, but these were students who hadn't been to they hadn't been to that many,
Right.
Other places. What it turns out is that Church's franchises at the time were in low income areas. Low income
Right.
areas in Boston were, going to be Black areas, but that wasn't necessarily the case with low income areas in Utah and Wyoming, so.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
but anyway, that was how that one came about.
I love it, and like I said, I had went back to some of the guys I grew up with, and I was just asking some questions. I remember I just called my homeboy, but one of my buddies, I'm a little older, so I don't say homeboy, I guess. Like, but he reminded me of several things, like the quarter waters.
Uh-huh.
There was a story about that sterilizer black males, the uh, malt liquor and St. Ives and different
Yeah, 40
beers.
ounce 40
Yes,
ounces.
yes, yes. So yeah, I mean, it was a good nostalgic moment, but to your point, the idea, when we were, I don't even know how it was brought to any of our attentions, but when we were like living in this moment, there was no way you couldn't tell us that whatever this recipe was detected black DNA.
Yes. Well, you're young and, your scientific literacy isn't quite
That's funny. So I mean, and you have so many pieces, like so. Wait a minute, but before, because I mean, so many people know of your work. So let me ask you this, and we did a light interview some time ago for class, and that was really intriguing, and I really enjoyed that conversation, because I find it amazing when people successfully, and a lot of people do this, but it's all. I don't want to. How can I frame this? There's just been I guess, discourse of academic versus public, and
Mhm.
in today's era, it's more of a, hey, this is part of the broader conversation of our field.
Yeah.
But at one time, that was really a thing.
Yeah.
And as this is happening, you other people too, but our concern is you tonight, w- were able to bring both of these things together, right? And this is a clear example, kind of academia, along with, I guess, hands-on ethnographic and folkloristic research, right? That you were working
Yeah.
with your class.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, and I think that, well, so many of the things that, if the genre of folklore that you're focusing on is going to be prevalent or prominent in younger people, your students are your best partners for this. Your students are your best partners if you're doing hip hop, if you're doing, rumors or legends, if you're doing jokes, so many things. Your students tend to like ethnographic assignments.
Mm,
They tend, in my experience, what I had a colleague who actually wrote a book about this, because if you give students an assignment that says, using the theories we've discussed in this folklore class this quarter, do a deep dive into your family's Thanksgiving traditions. And, for your final exam or whatever, really articulate the different genres that are used, and food ways and folk speech, and, do that. How does your family come together? What movies do you watch, and so forth? When you give that assignment versus an assignment that might say, talk about the development of the Thanksgiving tradition in the United States,
mm,
and use 5 external sources and write a paper on that. A student is always going to feel comfortable about their family's traditions. Like, you're the authority there, right? Like, you are the authority on whether or not your family watches Home Alone at 8 o'clock every Thanksgiving night, or football is on from 10 in the morning, and there's always a fight between your father and your uncle at around 12:30 over, whatever. Like, you are the authority. So all you have to worry about is the writing of it and telling the story. Whereas if you give something that several different, esoteric people have written books about, you don't feel like the authority then. You might miss something. You might quote the wrong person on whether or not Native Americans really brought a turkey to the first Thanksgiving or whatever. So you're both ill at ease about the content, and then a lot of times students are ill at ease about the writing and the presenting of things. So folklore always, I think, if taught correctly, enables you to make progress with students' abilities to express themselves. And again, my generation of teaching, it was very much about writing papers. Now I think there are a lot more visual oriented things that people do, but you're the expert on your lore. No one, no, you're the expert on what is said on a Saturday night when you and your homeboys are hanging out. Like no, nobody knows that better than you, and you,
Right.
and so when somebody tells you write that up and use the theories that we've covered in this course about masculinities or how men relate to each other, and use your Saturday night as a case study, you're much easier for you to do that.
True that. True that. So, what what I would like to know is, along with what you just shared, was there a thought of preparing students to go into the field?
That is, in retrospect, something that I wish I had had more of an opportunity to do. My career has never had me at an institution that, while I was at it, had an active folklore program.
Hmm.
So when I was teaching in my first faculty job in Boston and I taught African American folklore, it was just one of the courses in the undergraduate major in African American studies. And it was a general education course that was open across the campus. So it was kind of a one off. There was an English teacher who also taught one folklore course there, but there was no coherent folklore program. When I went my next job, where I spent the bulk of my career at UC Davis, I had a joint appointment between African American Studies and American Studies, and there were a couple of more people who taught folklore there. They brought me there, they recruited me, but we didn't have a certificate program or a graduate program. There was no mechanism for feeding students into something. So if a
Hmm.
student was really promising, and for most of us, there was just the one course you taught African American folklore, and there wasn't something to turn them on to. UCLA had a folklore program, but um, it had been sunset before I arrived at UCLA. So again, and I think if opportunities had put me at, Penn or Indiana or Texas or Kentucky or, one of the places that had folklore, that certainly would have been, something I would have been able to devote more energy to.
Well, no, I think that's because there's a lot of folklore coming out of this era. So it's like it's there. It just didn't have many departments or
Right.
many degrees.
Yeah, exactly.
So I wonder, and possibly not a fair question. So I'm not, but just your thoughts on the idea of how that affected black students who had some interest. Right.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid question. I think that we still have so far to go to get Black students to even think about graduate degrees in
Right.
any, you know, in
Yeah.
any field. We've still got a mountain to climb there. and then within something that is as niche oriented as folklore is, adds yet another layer to that. And so you've got to hope. I'm a big believer in many campuses, the folklore classes that are taught satisfy general education requirements
Right.
that the students that are majoring in the sciences and other fields have to take, and you can often snare people in there. But it's a matter, and then you level onto that. um, I think that lot of African American students or students interested in African American materials still suffer from imposter syndrome. uh,
Hmm.
and so just even signaling to the professor that they like this, that they want to do more of this, can be really hard. It's part of that hidden curriculum thing, right? They the I when I was at Davis, would have students, I'd encourage students to come to my office hours, and there was a stigma against going to a faculty member's office hours because that was, in their minds, telescoping that they needed help, that they weren't
Right.
good at
Wow.
something, and they needed to know why they got a C on the exam, or they needed guidance, and they didn't want to put a target on themselves as needing a professor's, and to tell them, no, I have my ace, the white students who get A's who are interested in this, they come to my office hours all the time. Students who want to, read more, or want to say, hey, is there anything I can do with this after college? I really like this stuff. They have no trouble coming to your office, and you've got to change the mindset there, to enable that. So it's a challenge.
Well, it is, and that kind of is a great segue. I have an inclination you've done this before. um, a great segue to the idea of applied, right? Um, and in the Black Studies text by Norman, he spoke of taking these courses and fields and bringing it back to communities, to help in whatever capacity. Um, and that also kind of infers public facing work through the academy. I set it up that way because, again, our first conversation slash interview was based on um, you in engaging in applied work in
Yeah,
within the academy.
yeah,
And I would really love for you to share that with us, but then also explain its significance for the field period, but also for Black and Brown people in the field. Everything is not just
yeah.
in the community, right?
Right. So I think that, um, and one of the challenges for me and for my generation with that is, it's a testament to the positive things about technology that, you're in Indiana, right? That's where you are
Yes.
right now. Physically, you're sitting in Indiana, and I
Yes, right this second.
and I am sitting in California, and we are having this conversation like when I was, and other people will be able to watch this conversation. Like that's a remarkable thing, and something we didn't even have the imagination to think about when I was a student. But public facing then, and still is the case. But my kind of work, probably the most of it, if I had to quantify, was around the quilter work.
Mhm.
It was around I told the story about starting with the Smithsonian. Quilts are inherently visual, and so they lend themselves to festivals, to museum presentations, to quilt guild groups, to various venues. I'm a member of the African American Quilt Guild of Oakland in absentia because I now live 6 hours from Oakland. But when I lived in Northern California, we did all kinds of things in libraries and various kinds of publics. Uh, and I think that part of the value that came there was often to the maker themselves and their family. A lot of again, it's the whole imposter syndrome thing again. A lot of the quilters were reticent to display and showcase their work. And when they did, and when somebody like me stands there and says that this is in a tradition that can be identified as, a double wedding ring quilt, which was traditionally a gift given, and blah blah blah, that sort of you can sort of see them hear that and be like, "Oh, I'm a part of a tradition." And sometimes you'd see if their families came to the presentation, it's like, "Wait a minute, grandma has a value and this quilt that she gave me when I went to there that whole thing I think is as important for folklorists to do as the direct faculty to student work that we do.
I dig it. I dig it. And I mean, you know, what I really love about that answer, and I'm not going to hold you too much longer, but it's um it evokes the idea of face-to-face communication, which there's not so much of anymore,
Yeah.
right? What I will ask you to bring it to a close, wh- what would you tell, whether it's an emerging, upcoming, or someone interested, whatever their age is and whatever their background is, what they're thinking about? I do this for a hobby, and I'm very. I think I could do this as a for a living. What would you tell them, or even if they didn't want to do it for a living?
You know my nerdiness is gonna show in this answer, but, we started with somebody told me to read some books, and I read some books. And that won't be for everyone. For some people, the reason that folklore will be appealing is because it's telling them, one of the things that you know better than I do, that the blues traditions and the R&B traditions, the music traditions that they may have taken for granted in their household have value. So it may be that for someone else, it's not go read these books. It's like, oh, you like these contemporary artists? Why don't you play some of the people that influenced them? Why don't you
Hmm.
find the artists that they were listening to when they were young, and then find the artists that they were listening to when they were younger. Um, um, oh, you're a crafter, you like to sew. Why don't you go to the local quilt guild and see if you want to participate in what they're doing? So I think there are all kinds of entree points aside from the academy, quite frankly, for people who have within the field of folklore found something that really resonates with them. Foodways. Um, oh, you like to cook? Why don't you start collecting cookbooks, or why don't you take a look at some of the recipes that were published for Black churches as fundraisers, all those old cookbooks. Why don't you take a look at them and see if they speak to you? And what have you ever thought of interviewing your grandma about her recipes? You say she doesn't write them down. You write them down, uh, and uh, and just find that entree point.
I dig it. I really appreciate your time. Let's tell the people where they could find your work, where they can get to you, and also, is there any exciting news you wish to share?
I'm currently working on a book that focuses on the two Black communities where that I was born into, two neighboring communities on the eastern end of Long Island. One in Bridgehampton, New York, which was where my parents migrated to from Virginia, and it was very rural community. And as you know, when people talk about the Black migration, we're often told that it's Black people came from rural areas to urban areas, and very little attention has been paid to the people who went from a southern rural area to a northern rural area and stayed involved in agriculture, as my folks did. So that's one of the communities, and they came with a whole cohort of the people that they had gone to school with. So I can go to the graveyard where my grandfather is buried in Virginia and find names on tombstones, and then I can go to where I grew up in New York and find people buried 100 years later, and their
Wow.
names are the same as the, so these families migrated together. And then the other community, which a lot of more people have heard of, Sag Harbor, is a second home Black community that has a very rich history that has not been fully developed. So I'm writing a book about that. And yesterday, it's a 6-chapter book. And yesterday, I finished my first draft of the 4th chapter. So I'm feeling very good about myself. Two more drafts to go. So that will be the next thing. If you go to my website, I've changed the title, but if you go to my website on the landing page at the bottom, it talks a little bit about this project, and you can see pictures of me when I was 6 years old and other things. So that's what's coming next.
That is groovy. We will have it in our library.
Oh, I
And
love that confidence you have in me, Lamont. That's good. That's
yes, I want to thank you on behalf of the platform, on behalf of myself, and on behalf of my many cohorts and colleagues who all champion you. And just thank you.
Thank you. And I'm so pleased to see the progress you're making in the field.
Thank you. Good folks, I'm going to look up Dr. Turner, get these books. And if you can find Church Chicken in the Klan, you got to read that. All right. Thank y'all, and we'll see y'all next time.
Okay.